Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Managing Disruptive Change. Before we start digging deeper into our topic, I would like to start with some examples in order to make you understand what we are talking about. Do you remember these companies? For sure you remember these companies. Kodak, we used to have the Oscars in the Kodak Theater. And we also used our mobile phone. Actually, I used a mobile phone when I was a little younger. So these companies were very, very well known. But what do these companies actually have in common? Let's look at Kodak first. Kodak, for about 100 years, was market leader in photography. Actually, they invented the photography for every individual, every American. They created the so-called Kodak moment. They started in the 80s of the 19th century by going into that business. And what they basically did, they took photography from the portrait studios into every Americans' homes and all over the world. And they remained market leaders until the 17th of the 20th century. But then something happened. The digital photography came up. And actually, Kodak was the one who developed digital photography. They had the invention of digital photography. But they also failed in taking up that development and being successful also in the digital photography world, which at the very end led to the point that in 2012 they had to file for bankruptcy. Let's look at the other example, Nokia. Nokia is also a very historical company. I mean, more than 100 years old. They started in the 70s of the 19th century with rubber boots and rubber tires and all sorts of products. In Finland, basically, and then all over the world. And then they developed a mobile phone. And this was one of the very popular Nokia mobile phones, and it was spread all over the world. And actually, they became market leader. At least in 1998, they were selling, I think, about 41 million mobile phones, and they were the #1 in the world market for selling mobile phones. However, a little later, smartphones came up. And if you look at the development from the 90s until today, it's not really a success story. Nokia struggles to keep pace with Apple. Nokia smartphone sales continue to decline, and so on. So at the very end, Microsoft took over, and actually, Nokia is not successful, or is said to be not successful anymore. Looking at the recent development, maybe they can catch up again, but we'll look at that. So that's the second example of a company, Kodak and Nokia, two examples of companies who were very, very successful companies. However, they weren't able to keep up in a very specific moment of change. Let's look at other companies, Starbucks and IBM. What do these companies have in common? Starbucks is known as a coffee chain. Actually, they started as a very, very simple coffee shop. They made this coffee shop very popular all over the world with very special coffee, not only cappuccino, espresso, and so on, but all sorts of frappuccinos and else. And they were also successful in the so-called customer-facing innovation. So they were able to take up the smartphone movement. People want to have customer retention programs on the smartphones. Starbucks, for example, introduced mobile payments as one of these developments. This is what makes them successful also today. And this is how Howard Schultz was putting that. Any business today that embraces the status quo as an operating principle is going to be on a death march. And they are not on the death march because they were able to develop further. And the other company, IBM, and there are many, many stories about IBM, especially also about Thomas Watson, who is in the picture over here. And Thomas Watson once says, there's only a world market for 5 computers. That was in '48. However, they were very successful in the personal computing, but also they developed from the traditional hardware with a very rough pace, to be honest, to artificial intelligence, to what we know by today, the IBM Watson, and every one of us knows the commercials about the IBM Watson and what the IBM Watson is able to do. So IBM also successfully managed to develop from a traditional hardware company to a leading edge technology company today. 4 companies, what do we learn from these examples? Well, first of all, we can differentiate those companies. We can say, okay, we have those 2 examples, Kodak, bankrupt today, Nokia, still surviving, which were disrupted. We have the disrupted companies. On the other hand, we have companies like Starbucks and IBM, and they were successful. They were actually successful in adapting what was coming up. And we can look at the IBM story later on to see that it's a rough path to be an adapter sometimes. But first of all, what we can see is there are many examples of companies, many examples of inventions, different inventions, some innovations, some not, that can change the world, and companies adapt in a different way to that. But what's the secret to that?